schools or police or things like that. This is a huge statement. Now, granted, I'm a nerd, but I want you to understand that that was a watershed moment. It was the first time that our federal government had said that there might be valid policy reasons, not legal reasons, but policy reasons to let a state go forward with regulating marijuana. So it was actually quite huge. I know it doesn't sound that exciting to you, but again, I'm a nerd. So take this situation that's happening with Washington and Colorado and the federal government saying this, and then I'm down in Uruguay in the spring. And I don't know if you're aware of this, so Uruguay is a tiny little country. It's the second smallest country in Latin America. On July 31st, their House of Delegates, their federal House of Representatives, voted to pass a full marijuana legalization measure that will include a regulatory system for production and distribution of marijuana within that country. Their Senate is supposed to be voting on it this month, before the end of the month. And it's believed that there will be no problem passing it in the Senate because the party vote distribution is even better in the Senate than it is in the House of Delegates. And this all came about because the president, this President Jose Mujica, who said that he wanted to legalize and regulate marijuana. This is a big deal because they will be the first country in the world to do this. Now, there are maybe some arguments, not really, but there are very thin arguments that the United States of America can make that what Washington and Colorado have done don't put the United States in violation of international treaties demanding that we prohibit production and distribution of drugs. There's no argument whatsoever for Uruguay. No question at all that what they're doing is in complete violation of international treaties. What's great is they're going to do it anyway. And you know why they're going to do that, right? Out that I should have been standing. I'm very sorry for those of you in the back of the room. So what is great about this is good on us because Washington and Colorado essentially, by taking the votes that they did, made it possible for other countries throughout the world to say, oh, wait a second. Wasn't it the United States of America that was telling us that we had to pursue prohibitionist policies and crack down on people and arrest them and throw them into jail for using drugs and growing marijuana? Wasn't it the U.S.? So, and didn't the U.S. just say that it was okay if Washington and Colorado did what they just did? I wonder what we can do now. I mean, that is what's happening. So when I get to go to these other countries and they're asking, I mean, they literally are asking me, okay, how did you do that? Can you just break that down for us? But then what's exciting is they're not all going to do what we did. Every country is different, just like every state's different. Missouri's not going to do what Washington did or what Colorado did. Missouri's going to do what's right for Missouri. But what's exciting right now is that other countries are now, it feels like this sort of global ping pong where the United States of America is stuck in the middle, our federal government's stuck in the middle. So Colorado and Washington batted the ball across the net. Uruguay's going to bat it back. Missouri's going to bat it back. Mexico's going to bat it back. And the next thing we know, that net in the middle is going to come down. And I think that's how federal prohibition in the United States of America is going to stop. It's going to come to an end. It's going to be pressure from us on the inside, paving the way for countries on the outside to say, it's not politically possible that the United States of America is going to come down and enforce sanctions on us when their own people are rejecting their law and they're opting out of the war. So let's keep up the battle because that's how we're going to get the feds to come down.
I don't know if there's anything left for me to say. I think they hit, pretty much most of the major points here. But there are just maybe a couple things I want to touch on. And as Dan was talking about, giving a little bit of the history, going back to Prohibition and comparing Prohibition of alcohol to what we're dealing with today, there's a good book to read regarding the collapse of alcohol prohibition, and it's by Daniel Krent, called The Last Call. And from that book, you can learn about, the strategies of how that happened, how they actually repealed the 18th Amendment, not just change the law, but change the Constitution back again. So I think that's important to read. We have our members, our speakers read it, so they can stay in tune as to what happened back then, because there are a lot of parallels between then and today, and the focus, the laser focus that they had on the work that they did back then to end it. I'm going to come forward a little bit and talk about the marijuana movement of the 1970s. Because when Jimmy Carter was president, many people thought that was going to be the end to marijuana prohibition. And, there are people saying that, well, it was pushed back then. They were making headway, and it was pushed back then, and here we are, still pushing for it today. So what's the difference between then and now? Primarily back then, the movement was about people who liked to use marijuana. Okay, they didn't want anyone telling them what they can and can't put in their bodies. Our flower children, Woodstock, that whole movement of folks. And, Richard Nixon was dealing with that, the Vietnam War and all that. And as Alison said, he comes up with his Southern strategy, for dealing with that and so on. Today, it's not just about people wanting to use marijuana. It's a human rights movement, not just a marijuana movement. The things that have happened over the past 4 decades that have ballooned our prisons, it's a human rights issue. It's no longer just the people who like to use weed. And I like this because, this is what Ethan Nadelman says from the Drug Policy Alliance. He says, it's not just a movement of people who like weed. It's about a movement of people who hate drugs, who love drugs, who hate drugs, and then you have the group that just don't give a damn about drugs. It's about the policy, a policy that has failed, that was dead on arrival, that never did work for many of the people in this movement. So we're not going in the other direction. This is not the 1970s, okay? The poles are moving in one direction, and that's the direction they're going to continue to move. So that's the difference. So when you hear people talking about what happened back then, that's what you tell them. So a key part of this, all these different groups of people today now involved in this movement, who weren't involved back in the 1970s, also makes a distinct difference. ACLU, come on, and talk about some weight behind something, some power and strength behind the movement, normal, okay? Drug Policy Alliance, yes, law enforcement against prohibition, and you've got thousands of police officers, law enforcement folks behind it too. You've got the NAACP behind it, okay? And on, and then the many local organizations like Show Me Cannabis, all across the country. The key to it is, though, is that we partner. The key to it is that we any little differences that we do have, versus the medical community, versus the legalized tax and regulate community, you got to put those little differences aside for today to move the policy that needs to be moved for tax and regulate across this country. That's the momentum that we're building. And it started really in 2010 in California with Prop 19. That's when these groups of people from all different walks of life really started coming together to move an issue. Even though Prop 19 did not pass, it started this movement, it started this momentum, and no matter what you're doing in life, if you want to succeed in something, a movement, you got to have momentum. And once you get momentum, don't relinquish it. Don't slow down. Don't let it up. One chink in the armor can push you back. We have momentum. Let's keep momentum, and we will bring this to an end. No doubt. So when do we think, this is going to really, happen? Some people are saying, we've reached the tipping point, and then you have some people saying, well, let's not get too excited about it, whatever. When I first started speaking for Leap, the co-founders, Jack Cole and Peter Chris, were saying, we're not doing this work for us, we're doing it for our grandchildren. We're doing it for our grandchildren. You got to get that in your mind and just be good with that, and that's who we're doing it for. They're now saying, hell, we're doing it for us. You know, and Jack Cole, I know you're recording this, so Jack, I'm sorry, but Jack Cole's no spring chicken right now. You know, he just had another birthday. He's in his mid-70s, but he's doing good. But we're doing it for this generation. So it is happening. It's happening very soon. Despite the challenges with the federal government and with the United Nations Treaty, you know, the bottom line is this is still a country where the people make it happen. The people make it happen. And as long as we continue to change the minds of people and move the polling numbers, it doesn't matter what Washington, D.C. wants. Because just like with an end to alcohol prohibition, state by state, as Dan said, state by state by state, we made it happen. And anytime you have Maryland, my home state, I mean, Missouri is one thing. I mean, you guys get to do voter referendum. Not in Maryland. You know, our legislators have to move. But now, because of what's happened in Washington State and Colorado, our legislators are like, do we really want to be last? Do we really want to be bringing up the rear on this? Because everything indicates that it's going to happen soon. And so they're thinking about it. They're looking at the polling numbers that we've recently done in the state of Maryland, well above 50%. And those legislators, you know, because they don't lead, they follow us in the polls. And so state by state, it's going to happen. And one thing that I always remind the legislators in the state of Maryland is that the state of Maryland never participated in alcohol prohibition. We never did. So we're going to be one of the first ones out of marijuana prohibition.
I bet there's some people itching for questions. Miranda is the first one.
Alison, you talked about kind of the ping-pong between Colorado and Washington and Uruguay back to the U.S., and then you mentioned Mexico. I'm curious if you could give us some insight into what's going on in Mexico. Because from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, the president's not very, he's not in favor of legalizing marijuana. But it's definitely obvious that Mexico is taking a very hard hit from our war on drugs and spreading it around in Mexico. So I'd be curious to know how the conversation is going there. How soon can we expect them to be considering making that move? And do you think it'll happen before the U.S. does it?
Not to put you on the spot.
Right. And not that any of this will come back to bite me later, right? I mean, how could I be wrong? What mistake could I make? So what's happening in Mexico, on the one hand, of course, it's horrific. For those of you that aren't familiar with exactly how it happened, basically in December 2006, when the former president, help me. Thank you. No, not Vicente Fox, after Vicente Fox, Felipe Calderon, thank you. When Felipe Calderon took office, he decided that he was going to crack down on the cartels. And essentially what happens when you take off the head of an animal like that is that it just splinters. It becomes a very violent organizations competing against organizations for territory. So that is what sort of launched the violence that's happening in Mexico. By last tallies I've heard, there's up to as many as 100,000 men, women, and children who have died, and another 25,000 who have disappeared since December 2006. And even when Peña Nieto took office, it didn't abate. Sort of the thought was that Peña Nieto would change the tactics. So he would demilitarize the attack on the cartels a bit and try to at least take the violence out of the strategies, but that's not happening. There's still quite a bit of bloodshed occurring. Mexico City is where there is an effort to push legalization forward at the city level, or at least a tolerance of a change in policy. Sort of, we haven't really talked about different strategies for approaching marijuana law reform, but one, for example, some of you may be familiar with some cities that have adopted lowest law enforcement priority initiatives where you haven't actually changed the law, but you've told your police department and your prosecutors that you want marijuana to be their lowest law enforcement priority, so maybe something like that. There appears to be some traction within the national government in Mexico to allow Mexico City to try something different, which could sort of be a foothold to establish that we can do something different, the sky won't fall, and this will be politically feasible. I think that the secret to Mexico is California. And a lot of people are talking about California going in 2016, and I'm sure when Dan and Neill were at the DPA conference, the Drug Policy Alliance conference in Denver recently, that everybody was talking about 2016. And I'll just go on record here saying I think they ought to go in 2014. Because when California goes, Mexico will have to do something different. And I think the conversation about what's possible is politically easier to have in 2014 than in 2016. I think in 2016, when our presidential election is on the ballot, it becomes a very dicey conversation for us. I mean, what's Hillary Clinton going to say during the primaries about whether or not it's a good idea for Mexico to legalize marijuana? I'm not really comfortable with that. What Jerry Brown has to say about California legalizing marijuana in 2014, I'm not that worried about. I'm a little bit more worried about what the federal dialogue will look like in 2016 and how that will impact policy change in Mexico. So I don't know that it's possible. California is sort of the holy grail. You know, when California goes, the conversation's going to change a lot in this country. So we don't want to rush into something that's not going to work. But if it's possible, I would love to see a lot of effort go into moving California in 2014.
I believe the Canadians beat Uruguay to the point of thumbing their nose at the UN resolution when the Inside Clinic came up as a debate 7 years ago. The Tories and the Grits wanted to close down the free injection clinic where the heroin addicts can actually go into Health Canada offices in Vancouver and get help from the nurses, roping off their veins, sterilizing the water, finding it, and pushing it in. They said that's creating an illegal market, it should be illegal, and Harper's little health minister actually had the UN say no, 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 but where is that 7 years later? 500 people go in to get assistance shooting up still, so she's right. The UN's worthless on that. I did want to ask you a question though. All over Washington State, it's sensible Washington, before 502, and just get rid of all the rules where there's no preemption. What's wrong with that? And then that's kind of like a checkmate to the government. They can't say anything. Then we start adding the minor possession, the DUI, the one little thing is one after another, and it allows home growth for everyone. What's wrong with a sensible Washington approach where we just say, forget, take it totally off the schedule, take it totally off the law books, like radishes at the end of Missouri law. So let's think like radish, let's just remove the law altogether. That's what sensible Washington says. What's wrong with that approach?
Right. So from a legal perspective and from a policy perspective, nothing at all. There's nothing wrong with that at all. The problem is the politics of it. Can you actually get a majority of voters in a state to vote for full repeal of all of the state's marijuana laws? And the analogy to alcohol prohibition and the repeal of alcohol prohibition is neat and tidy, and it sounds good, but the reality is culturally, we were in a very different place with alcohol prohibition than we are with marijuana prohibition. We were a nation of drunkards when alcohol prohibition kicked in. I mean, everybody drank, and we had industrial alcohol production happening, and there were saloons, there were factories, it was part of the fabric of American life, right, drinking. Then we had Prohibition, and it only took, and I say only, you know, Dan referenced the fact that it's kind of a big deal that this was passed by a constitutional amendment, and it's an even bigger deal that it was repealed by constitutional amendment. Amending the United States Constitution is not an easy undertaking. We did it in 13 years, right? I mean, it was 13 years from the beginning of alcohol prohibition to the end of it, and it was both were done by constitutional amendment. And the book that Neill referenced, Daniel Oprint's book on this, you know, just really emphasizes what a remarkable achievement that was. But culturally, we were comfortable with alcohol. We knew alcohol. That was our beverage. And when alcohol prohibition ended, there were, you know, Budweiser could just go back into business. The shops were already there. Marijuana in this country, I mean, we call it marijuana, right? It's cannabis. We call it marijuana because its entry into this country was always marked culturally as being other and alien, and that's what the brown people use, okay? Let's just be real clear that marijuana does not have the same cultural, we're not in the same cultural context with marijuana in this country as we are with alcohol. And so it started as the intoxicant of Mexican immigrants who we definitely wanted to criminalize as soon as the Great Depression started, right? And that's when you saw federal prohibition of marijuana kick in 1937. The states, especially out in the West, had already started making marijuana, the local weed, illegal because Mexican farmers were taking jobs that belonged to the white people. We were going into the Great Depression. Then you've got African American, West Indian people coming up, the freed slaves in the southeast part of the country. Marijuana was their intoxicant of choice, and damn it if those jazz players didn't start messing with our white women, right? Okay? So that's the history of marijuana, and then by the time marijuana became a white person's intoxicant, it was the hippies, it was the anti-Vietnam protesters, it was the people that President Nixon hated. That's why he hated marijuana so much. That's why marijuana is on Schedule 1, right? Is because it was a symbol. It wasn't about it being an intoxicant. It was a political symbol of anti-authoritarianism, of thumbing your nose at the man. And that was not okay, not tolerated. And even today, if you kind of step back 30,000-foot level and you look at what the marijuana culture is in the United States of America today, the stereotypes, they're not hippies anymore. I mean, there's some, but it's also now hip-hop, right? Hip-hop, no, it's sort of the anti-authoritarian, thumbing your nose at the man symbol. So that's why I think, because, and this goes back, I think, to what Neill was saying about the difference between the people that like to use marijuana and the people that don't like to use marijuana but might be willing to vote for legalization and regulation for different reasons. That's why I think, just politically, I think the full repeal of marijuana laws, we're probably not there yet. We may get there a lot quicker than I thought, you know. Definitely the tides are changing. But.
Thanks to you.
No.
I think we have time for one more question. John?
Okay. You both Neill and Alison, you referenced the change from the reform movement of the 70s and then everything gets stalled in the 80s. And how much credit do you give to, and this is probably my favorite story of that era, but there's one single incident that a lot of people point to, and it's Dr. Peter Bourne, who was the drug czar at the time, going into a party at Keith Stroop's house, who was the head of NORML, and going into a room with Christy Hefner, who's the daughter of Hugh Hefner, and Hunter S. Thompson, and doing a line of coke, and then that getting into the press, and that was it. He was fired. And, how much do you think that had to do with the change from Carter to the real crackdown on Reagan?
Well, obviously, I think it had a punch. I think it had something. It was obviously something significant. But I think that what was more significant was the Len Bias incident. Because when you think about, for those of you who don't know the Len Bias incident in the 1980s, Len Bias was a University of Maryland basketball player, a hell of a player. And he was just, he was supposed to be, better than the Michael Jordans and better than all those other players that had come before him. But he was drafted to the Celtics, the Boston Celtics, and he was celebrating, and he was doing cocaine, and obviously he died from doing cocaine. And inside the Beltway, Capitol Hill, they just went crazy. I mean, they went absolutely crazy. That's when they started writing all these mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. Those of you who didn't know Eric Sterling, he was one of the major architects of these mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. He's now trying to undo them and undo that madness. And so, with the Len Bias thing, now we've got crack cocaine coming on the scene, okay? And all the frightening stories about crack cocaine, the crack babies, which we now find was absolutely false. Because now as they do the studies on the so-called crack babies, they see that their level of success is just the same as everybody else's. Now that they're teenagers and older. So the fear that was driven, but here's the key. The fear surrounded all drugs that were deemed illegal, not just cocaine from that instance. You know, cocaine was in both of those instances, Len Bias and the drug czar's instance. Cocaine, heroin, meth, we had PCP back then, and marijuana. Any of those drugs that were in that category were now, nothing was going to move. Nothing at all. And that's, you know, a huge contributor to the stalling of any movement, you know, forward with ending prohibition for any of those drugs that were deemed illegal. You know, remember, marijuana is that dangerous gateway drug that leads you to crack cocaine, heroin, and the other drugs, even though, again, we know that's now disproven. We all know that milk is the true gateway. Mother's breast milk. But, you know, if you group, you know, even if you cater to that gateway theory and you group all drugs together, we know that tobacco and alcohol is typically the first mind-altering substances that are used. Well, maybe not. Maybe spinning in a circle and getting dizzy. You know? So, you know, that's pretty much it. As far as a gateway drug, it's the environment, not the drug itself.
Can I tag on something Alison said?
Very,
Be real quick.
yes, very quickly.
Okay, well, she's talking about people that don't smoke and people that do smoke it. I come from a large family of about 80, all of us together. Maybe 10% of us do okay. But of the 70% that don't, I'm going to say about 90% are for legalizing it for other purposes. One is criminalizing it, but putting people in prison for a small amount of marijuana for 5 to 6 years. They don't even smoke it. They don't want to, but that's the reason they developed it.
Exactly. It's a human rights issue.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I think that's, Mike, I was gonna ask you guys if we had enough time, do you think is say one perfect message for moving forward with ending it, but you've already both said the humanitarian reason. That was what I would have said too, is, you know, it's a human rights issue. Once the way that we've stigmatized drug users and marijuana users, we make them less than people, and so they don't have rights. And you can give them, you know, some police officer in Texas thinks you can give a man 3 enemas to find out if he's got any drugs up there, and it's
Well, that was
very
New Mexico.
horrible. New Mexico, okay.
Yeah.
Apologies.
It's
And
terrible.
It's terrible either way. So
You want to know the truth about that?
yes, please.
That was an alien abduction.
New Mexico.
All right? Before we get all that.
All right, we are about 5 minutes behind, which is not so bad, but I want to give you guys 10 minutes of break. We are supposed to have the new ACLU Missouri director, Jeffrey.
Here he is.
Oh, great, he is here. So we'll be having him. 5 minutes, please get some pizza. There's pizza back